Welcome back. We are now looking at the classical era of ancient Greece. So probably some of the most familiar stuff that you'll know from ancient Greece, including architecture and sculpture from Athens, from the Acropolis. So things that you, I think, will find really interesting in this particular section. So again, we can divide the Greek classical period into phases, early, high, and late classical, but roughly throughout the 400s into the year 323 BCE. We have certainly seen a multitude of expressive images and highly detailed images using what you now know of as red figures. So again, that black background, red silhouettes with black line details continues in the classical era, but we do begin to see some more movement and more, I think, attention to perspective on the body. Again, when you start looking not just at the facial expressions, but look at things like the limbs. In this piece, you can clearly see foreshortening on the foot of this figure. It's really kind of remarkable to think about trying to fit a dynamic scene like this into a three-dimensional round form, such as this kylix, a drinking vessel. So again, those handles would be for your thumbs, and you can imagine that you would see this scene in full only when you tilted the cup upward to your lips to be able to drink. We also now move into the figure painting, or the white ground painting. This is a piece attributed to an artist known as the Achilles Painter. This is warrior taking leave of his wife, and it is Ethnitos, so it is a perfumed oil container. So again, look really closely at some of the detail that people are able to achieve with these new techniques, with that lighter ground but with a linear mark on top of it, and the addition now of multiple colors. It's, of course, very ancient, but when we look at it now, we can see reds, yellows, purples. But I think most remarkable, look at the feet on the warrior figure. You see one foot in profile and one foot fully foreshortened coming towards you in believable three-dimensional space. And if you look at the protective painting on his shield, you see an eye rendered truly in profile instead of an eye in full face looking out toward us. We actually see it depicted the way it would seem in perspective. So the sophistication of the ancient Greeks in the classical era just is, in every conceivable way, is really evident for us here in the artwork in terms of believable illusion of three dimension, in believable depiction of the body. We haven't seen anything like this in any of the cultures we've studied up to this point. You can definitely see that here in this white ground painting. Look at the foreshortening on the thigh. The warrior figure is seated, that foreshortening on his thigh, foreshortening in the boot on his foot. We absolutely see something that gives us believable three-dimensional human form, and we've just not seen that in any culture up to this point. The sophistication of these images, again, really makes it a shame that there are so few remaining examples of wall painting to be able to give us a sense of what the Greeks would have been fully capable of. If we had a time machine to be able to go back and look at this culture as it really happened, I think we'd be astonished at the level of artistic accomplishment, for sure. Again, we see a continuation of this form of the kind of kouros figure that we saw in the previous lecture. The Kritios figure is notable for the fact that he very clearly is taking a step forward. He is moving in three-dimensional space, but it allows for the very first time for us to be able to see a true reaction of the body to its relationship to gravity. We start to see three-dimensional weight shift, what we sometimes call the Contrapposto or the counterbalanced pose, is now evident. It's a little slight at this point, but you can see that the leg that seems to be doing the work, the leg that's carrying the weight as this foot moves, This leg has the knee at a higher level than this, which causes the hips to be at an angle on this side. The whole body really seems to be reacting in a believable way to three-dimensional space. You can see that in the curve of the spine as well. Even though it's still an idealized male heroic athletic form in the nude, which we're expecting to see in ancient Greece, we are starting to see that the body itself is being depicted in a way that, although perfect in terms of musculature and youthfulness and energy, it still has a sense that the artist had to know human anatomy, and to be able to create this had to know the workings of the body and its reaction to space and to gravity. It's also notable with this figure in particular, you see that his eyes are hollowed out. So he obviously would not only have been painted, but the eyes would have been inlaid probably with glass. But if you think about that empty space there, we haven't seen that in earlier carvings, but we do see it in Greek bronzes. So we can see kind of a callback or correlation between the Greek attempt to make the bronze figures feel alive is also now carrying over into attention to detail in the carved figures. The charioteer figure is a great example that not only has Contrapposto, but it almost has comically shifted all of its weight to one side, and you can see that in this, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but in this twerking image to the right, you can really see that one side of the body is carrying the weight while the other side is relaxed, and that's causing a counter shift in the shoulders to keep the body from falling over. So again, the charioteer figure would have had full arms. We would have seen all of the detail there, but of course, the more that a figure extends outward in its limbs from its base, the more likely or prone it is to breaking. Some classical pediment sculpture to know here. This is the West pediment. I want to specifically recognize the figure of Apollo from the West pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. And again, as I said in the previous lecture, when you look at what is displayed in a museum, you see only the remnants as opposed to an attempt to fill in the missing pieces. They're trying to showcase only what is original to the monument. And there are scaffold and framing devices in order to position the pieces of the sculpture in their correct position within the overall triangular composition. Apollo, of course, is a god of reason, and you see him very much acting as an avatar for the Greek people themselves. And what you're seeing is a conflict between a group of people who are analogous to the Greeks, the Lapiths and the Centaurs. The Centaurs are carrying the Lapith women away, and the Lapith men are fighting back. So it is kind of a symbolic way of the Greeks allowing themselves an opportunity to depict themselves as rational, heroic, stoic, non-emotional, non-overreactive, and their enemies, the foreigners, whom the centaurs represent, as beastly, as overly emotional. It really starts to create a tension of kind of us-them, an idea of the difference between how the Greeks viewed themselves and how they viewed everyone who wasn't Greek. You do get a sense of loss, I think, when you see recreations of what these temples should have looked like with their full painting and with gold decoration as well. So there's the reconstruct drawing gives you a sense of what's missing from what we just looked at the image of Apollo witnessing the attack between the Lapiths and Centaurs. But when you get really close to it, when you really look at the faces, you get a full recognition of the Greek need to stay calm in a crisis, to suppress emotion, to seek perfection, to think only in terms of how the individual can serve the greater good through being the most athletic, the most heroic, the most centered, the most rational. That sort of Greek idealism in the faces of these characters, the female character being carried off surely to be ravaged by this beast, by a human body on a human torso and head and arms on a horse body. The centaur character is the ultimate expression in some ways of what it is to be animalistic, to be other. quite frequently we talk about the difference in Greek culture between what we call the Apollonian, or the Greek way of thinking and being, the rational, thoughtful, suppressed emotion, versus the Dionysian, the wine god, the uncontrolled. And the centaurs really represent that other side. If you allow the passions to overrule you, what might happen? If you think of the Greeks as depicting themselves more often than not as the victors, they usually show their victories through their rationality, and they show the people that they're fighting against as almost like wild beasts. And that is absolutely true of the way the faces of the centaurs are depicted. But we haven't seen anything so far that comes close to this level of believability in anatomy, muscle structure, in both the animalistic form of the centaur, the horse aspect, the human bodies, but at the same time retains that sense of storytelling narrative that was so essential to getting the point of the stories across. Look at the difference between the Greek soldier, represented by the Lapith, being bitten in the arm by the centaur. He barely responds. He's not going to lose his cool or lose his emotion to this beast, but he is going to try to take it down, to defeat it in battle. And that's very typical of these types of scenes. So also at the Temple of Zeus at Olympia are a series of low-relief metopes in between the triglyphs, and they depict the 12 labors of Hercules. And so we have diagrams presented for you here that show you each of the labors. And then it's shocking to think this is all that remains of those stories. So they're presented with some indication of what's missing. Think about the level of work that it has taken for historians to be able to piece all of these little individual elements back together. Far more detail than we can go into here, but I encourage you to come back and take a look at it. This is what would have been at the temple, the one of the lost wonders of the world, the iron gold statue of Zeus by the sculptor Phidias. And so again, we have kind of an artist's recreation of the thing. Remarkable idea of what it might have been. Phidias is one of the sculptors whose names we actually know, and we see a lot of his work preserved. It's also interesting to see art about making art itself. This is a kylix, or a drinking cup, that shows the creation of cast bronze sculpture. So the figure here is not headless and being attached. That's the sculpture being built. There's the head that will be attached in these separate pieces. So we know that they cast pieces hollow and cast them in sections, which again is a technological marvel. This is one such bronze casting, and you can see here he retains some of the inlay in the eyes that we were referencing earlier. You can see that with bronze statuary, it is more you're more capable of the piece sustaining or being able to suspend itself over empty space without requiring support from beneath. We refer to this as tensile strength. Bronze is able to hold its own weight in space without needing support from below. You definitely see that. Probably the best example I can give you of the ability of bronze to span that horizontal space is this figure of Poseidon. A figure in marble this way would almost certainly have been broken off at the arms and probably at the ankles as well. But can you imagine this in the hands of the Egyptians? This concept of a powerful god figure is very much something we've seen in every culture we've studied up till now. But the amount of empty space and the amount of that's being carried on very thin ankles over empty space is just astonishing. The figures cry out to be seen from multiple points of view. These were recovered in the 20th century, if you can believe it. These pieces were found in 1972 off the coast of Italy near Mariachi. So we refer to these as the Mariachi Warriors. So there's a pair of them. They were found together. The one to know for the test is the figure to the left. But you can fully see here the the realization of the Contrapposto shift pose. Each figure has one leg carrying the weight and the opposite leg loose, and in each case you can see that continued into the shoulders. The arm that would have carried the shoulder or the spear is the engaged arm, and it's on the opposite side of the body from the engaged leg. And by that tilt in the hips and tilt in the shoulders continued into the turning of the head, even though it's slight in the figure on the right, you get a sense of the curvature of the spine and the full realization of human anatomy in a believable, responsive to space and gravity depiction, unlike anything we've seen previously. We also know that these figures were definitely articulated, or decorated rather, to try to make them more lifelike. The lips and even the nipples have copper on them so that they can, there you can see more, right? The attempt to make the figure more and more and more lifelike. Even though it's slightly stylized, even the way the hair and beard are dealt with is so much more believable in these figures than in those kind of systematic patterned kind of carvings that we saw in Mesopotamia, for sure. So definitely want you to be paying attention to the term contrapposto. The kuros that we saw at the beginning has its weight equally distributed on both legs, and quite frankly, no one really stands like that. In fact, there's a yoga pose called Tadasana, or mountain pose, in which you try to equally distribute your weight on both feet. You'd think a simple standing position would be really easy to do, but it requires a lot of thought and discipline. Most of us carry our weight on one side, engaging muscles on one side, and slack in the other if we're just standing upright. Think about how difficult it is to stand perfectly still and upright, and even we shift our weight back and forth all the time. It is absolutely part of that pose. Contrapposto literally means counterbalanced or counterposed, and you can really see that here again in the Mariachi bronze. Look at the shift in his hips. Clearly this hip is higher than that one, and clearly the opposite shoulder is higher than that one. So the legs carrying the weight shifts this hip up and requires the weight shift or counterbalance in the upper body to keep him upright. So we have multiple examples throughout the classical era of these innovations of the red figure detail and of the three-dimensional posing of contrapposto. You'll see it again and again and again. More eroticism begins to be evident as well. These are evident in some of the drinking vessels that were made for drinking parties, specifically all male, of course. Women were not allowed into these arenas for multiple reasons. But you can see the wildness of these figures and kind of the unbelievable level of attention to erotic detail that you wouldn't expect. This is one of the few examples I can give you of the paintings of murals in ancient Greece. It's known as the Tomb of the Diver. This is kind of reconstruction. I do allow you to see the pieces in place. True fresco or buon fresco technique done on marble. And it does show you the sense of one of these gatherings, again, all male, but then women were not allowed outside of the home. And you do see that they are reclining on couches as they are fed food and wine. You can see them holding kylixes and calling out for more wine as well. They're being entertained by music as well. And then the diver panel on the ceiling. That brings us to the Acropolis, perhaps one of the best known monuments of the ancient Greek world. Acropolis literally means city on a hill, city on a high place. And of course, the Greek gods lived on Mount Olympus, so it made sense to put temples on the raised or highest ground available. So the Acropolis is dedicated to Athena, to the goddess Athena. It is probably the most well-known of the temple complexes, but other cities had there were multiple temples on hills as well, which were also called Acropolis. The Acropolis in Athens has a multitude of different buildings that we'll look at. It is notable that it is in honor of Athena. The whole religious concept of this temple structure is really down to the myth of which god or goddess was going to win the veneration of this powerful city. So Athena and Poseidon were competing against each other to be the patron god of this place. And so in order to solve that conflict, the gods were asked to give a gift to the people of Athens. And so Poseidon, through his trident, struck a rock from which sprang a saltwater spring, symbolizing his power of the sea and the power of the sea as a food source, but also for the power of naval power of the Athenians. Athena, for her part, gifted the people of Athens an olive tree, and so she was giving the bounty of the earth, the bounty of the land, and settling and creating this connection between her, the earth people, through the olive tree. And so the Athenians chose the olive tree as the gift that they preferred, and that sparked a battle between the two gods. And so various aspects of this story are reflected in the buildings themselves. One of the most important of the traditions, religious traditions in Athens, was the carrying of a peplos, a heavy woolen garment, annually to the wooden statue of Athena that was housed in one of the temples of the Acropolis. And so the people would weave a new peplos once a year, and there would be a citywide celebration and a procession up the sacred way to present the peplos to the goddess. And so that is one of the central religious ceremonies of this culture. So you can see that when you get up to the top to the Acropolis, you have multitudes of different temples, small, some large. And so you would come up this kind of causeway and steps and enter through a gate. The largest of the buildings, of course, is the Parthenon, and the Parthenon is essentially in Doric style, although it incorporates some Ionic elements. It is perhaps the best example of the proportional rules of the Greeks. It's kind of fascinating to look at. Across the front, it has 8 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but along the sides, 17 columns. So twice plus 1. 2 times as many plus 1 is the number of columns along the side, and that proportional ratio exists throughout the building. So it has its entire structure based on geometry and mathematical ratio. And of course, the Greeks believed in a perfect system of beauty based on ratios and measurements of parts compared to wholes. So there is a connection between mathematics, architecture, religion, and visual beauty throughout this structure. The temple itself, of course, has entrances on the short side as opposed to the long sides, but people were meant to come up to and face the west end of the temple and walk around either the north or south end, and then if they entered through this end on the east. There are, you notice, a double colonnade on the 2 short sides, but solid walls all the way along these inner chambers. So there is, in fact, a continuous sculptural frieze on this inner colonnade and wall section. So behind this area, which has its traditional triglyphs and metopes all the way around, on this section, along the inner wall and along that second colonnade in the front and back, is a continuous frieze in the Ionic style. Unfortunately, the building is in terrible disrepair for a multitude of reasons, but probably the worst was that it was used during occupation by the Ottoman Empire. It was used as a storage space for ammunition and for gunpowder in particular. And the Parthenon was attacked by the Venetians in 1687. They set fire to the powder reserves in an attempt to weaken the Ottoman control, and that caused the gunpowder essentially to explode within and blew the building apart from the inside. So not only did that damage an incredible number of works, but a lot of the sculpture was literally blown off the outside of the building and fell in heaps in the surrounds of the ruins of that temple structure. And so later, still under the control of the Ottoman Empire, a British archaeologist negotiated for the collection of those pieces which had fallen to the ground for the purposes of preservation and study. And so a lot of the marble that belongs to the Parthenon is actually in a museum in England, which is kind of shocking to think about. However, it is a combination of the Doric and the Ionic style. So remember, we've looked at the columns at the capitals to tell the difference. You'll notice Doric columns around the outside of the Parthenon. You will see an Ionic style continuous frieze, though, on the inside. When we look at these changes, though, from Doric to Ionic, you'll notice that the Doric style tends to be more squat, the Ionic style more classically elegant and elongated, thinner, and taller. The Corinthian style, which we'll get to, is much thinner still, much taller in its proportion, and more elaborate in its depiction of emotion movement. Again, Acropolis, city on high or city on a hill. Polis literally means city. So the Acropolis means city on this hill. A necropolis would be a city of the dead. This is another reconstruction and cutaway to show you the front of the Parthenon with its alternating metopes, where the sculptures are, and the triglyphs, and then the continuous Ionic frieze on that second colonnade and then along the solid walls on the sides. So this is the West Pediment. This is the beginnings of Athena and Poseidon's battle for control of this city, or to have control of worship of the citizens of the city, really is the main purpose of the battle. And what you're seeing is the reconstruction of what this scene should have looked like. And we have only these remnant elements to go by. This is the Zeus Athena scene from the opposite pediment. This is the E pediment. And so again, it's a little hard to tell what's going on because there's such fragmentary artwork left. On the west side, we have the battle between Poseidon and Athena, and on the east side, which would be your entrance side, you have the birth of Athena. So Athena was born from the head of Zeus, so there would be his figure and Athena being born from that, and then various gods responding to that event. So what we have left of that statue is pretty limited, but we do have the chariot of the sun god Helios emerging out of the ground line of the pediment itself, almost as if it's the horizon and the sun is literally rising up. We have the god Dionysus drinking at dawn, I guess. Then you have a series of other gods and goddesses. We're not sure who they are. The missing figures of Zeus and Athena, and then these three figures to the right, known as the three goddesses, probably the single most famous piece of sculpture from that pediment. And the whole story ends with the moon goddess and her chariot sinking below the horizon. Pretty remarkable sculpture there. There's Dionysus. And there's the three goddesses. This is probably the single most important piece to recognize from that element in terms of its style. So the sculptor Phidias, who we met a little while ago, was the director of the sculptural decoration of these temples at the Acropolis. So we sometimes call this style of the way these figures are depicted Phidian style. In specific, that refers really to his overly exuberant decoration elaboration of the drapery. I sometimes think of it as wet drapery technique. We sometimes joke about it being similar to a wet t-shirt contest. If you imagine wet fabric clinging to the body, that's exactly how Phidias has managed to give the female body the covering that allows us to keep the modesty of the body, but it allows elements of the body to protrude so that we can see the breast, for instance, you can see the thigh, you can see aspects of the body where it's considered appropriate, but notice that the drapery tends to bunch up and obscure the body to maintain its modesty. But it does look as if the fabric itself is not just got a lot of folds, and also looks as if it's very, very heavy, and you could almost think of it as being heavy with moisture. It feels almost as if it's wet. It certainly flows like air or like water. The metopes are really pretty interesting sculptures as well. So there are multiple depictions of the metopes all along the outside of the temple of the Parthenon. So it depicts various battles. There are between Greeks and Amazons. There's battles showing Greeks against the Trojans. There's battles showing the gods versus the Titans, giant Tamaki. But I think the most interesting ones in some ways, again, depict the story of the Lapiths versus the Centaurs. We're pretty familiar with that particular storyline. Again, you can go through each of these in more detail, but you definitely get a sense of the Greeks presenting themselves as the heroic, rational figures versus their enemies, in this case, in the guise of the Centaurs. The whole reason for this, of course, is that the temples on the Acropolis, the original temples to Athena, had been destroyed by the Persians. And as Pericles gains control of Athens, and Athens becomes the lead city in the Delian League, which are preventing further aggression from the Persians, protecting the Greek people from the Persian Empire, Pericles dips into the war chest of the Delian League for the money to rebuild and glorify the Acropolis in the city of Athens. And so this symbolically is like the Greek supremacy over all foreign invaders. And so you get a sense of that need for the foreigners to be depicted as monstrous, and for the Greeks to be depicted as heroic and stoic in their emotionless resolve to defeat their enemy. Really pretty beautiful sculpture, all those metopes. This gives you a sense of the painting that should be still evident in the sculpture. This is a painting of people showing almost like an art reception, viewing Phidias' sculpture as it's finished. This is what we call the Panathenaic frieze, that interior continuous frieze that is behind the metopes and triglyphs on the outer colonnade. And that really does depict a number of different scenarios. It shows people and animals, human beings, daily people, but in a religious ceremony, in a procession, most likely bringing the peplos garment to put on the statue of the goddess. And so we see kind of rising and falling action. The figures do get a little more calm and sedate as we get closer to delivery of the peplos. You can see there's some wild movement in the horses at the beginning, really pretty dramatic, exciting movement that you see there. And then as we get close to the presentation element, here you see Athena herself, marked here as 36, and then you see the figures most likely carrying the very garment that they're going to put on the cult statue of Athena. So in a pretty remarkable way, you have a combination of gods in human beings in the presence of the gods. Definitely we have hierarchy of scale, right? Because height of the sculptural frieze can't change, but we see that the figures seated obviously are much larger scale than the standing figures. There's indication there that those are the gods. This is what we probably should see, this is the reproduction in Nashville, Tennessee, of all places. There's a reproduction of the Parthenon, including a reproduction of what they think the statue of Athena would have looked like in that largest of the temples. Now, the peplos that they're bringing to her is not for this statue. It is for a much smaller wooden statue that's housed in a different temple. But you can see why this statue would no longer be in existence, because obviously somebody wanted to melt it down for the gold that it was made from, gold and ivory. So our architects of the Parthenon are Ethnitos and Kallikrates. The Parthenon is the building, the main temple to Athena, so you definitely want to be able to recognize that one for the test. This diagram includes some explanation of the entasis of the columns, but also some of the other corrections that were made to the building. It is exaggerated in this diagram, and in this one, but it gives you a sense of what was done to allow a building this big to appear perfectly straight to our eyes. It is so big that if you were to see it on site, it might actually look as though the corners were higher than the center. It would seem to sag. So in order to compensate for this, the center of each side, both the short sides and the long side, are actually a few inches higher than the extreme ends on either side, and that corrects this visual imbalance. It's also interesting to think that the building would feel a little bit as if these columns on the outside were too far away. They would seem to kind of stick out. They actually are slightly closer together at the outer corners than the columns are in the center, and that also is a correction to make the building seem perfect and pleasing to our eyes. Another temple on the site I definitely want you to know is the Erechtheion, which is one of the weirdest temples in all of ancient Greek architecture. It is, in some respects, really un-Greek in that it does have a portico, a set of columns along its front, but because it is placed in such an odd area that also needs to commemorate some aspects of the battle between Poseidon and Athena, instead of having a companion set of 6 columns on a portico on its opposite side, that portico actually is turned around the corner here. So this is now known as the North Porch, which in a kind of marries this porch. But also, when you're on this end, it feels odd that there isn't a set of columns on the opposite side. So there's also this smaller porch that has the caryatid figures. So you see here the caryatids and the North Porch. This is essentially the facing porch. You would come up to the building this way and then come around it, most likely on either side, probably on this side, that would be your main approach, which would allow you a staircase entrance to a courtyard that includes, you can see here it's been replanted, an olive tree, which of course was meant to be the olive tree that had been gifted to the people of Athens by the goddess Athena. The most remarkable aspect of the building, though, I think, are the carved statuary columns of women that support the roof on this opposite porch, this south porch, known as the Porch of the Maidens. They are, of course, caryatids, the female equivalent of statues of men carved in columns. These, of course, would be very weak, one would think, at the neck. Remember that the last time we saw carved statuary columns of any grand scale really was in the tomb of Ramses II. We saw Ramses' statuary acting as columns, but those were carved out of solid cliff faces, so really they weren't functional in terms of holding the roof up. These are obviously fully three-dimensional and are holding up masonry work. So in order to make sure that they're not too weak at their lowest point, the neck, notice that there's an enormous amount of attention to beautifully detailed braiding, which actually just acts as a stabilizing force for that entire element. thereby bringing more weight and more solidity to the most narrow portion of the human body. We can see them being imitated even into the 20th century, believe it or not. This is a design by a postmodern architect in America, Michael Graves. His design for the Disney office building in Burbank, California, uses carved statuary as columns. It's a pretty funny joke when you think about the difference in culture and time, but also this kind of play on using a cultural historical example. It's really pretty funny. The Temple of Athena Nike includes sculptural relief that would have been visible as you approached up the grand staircase into the temple gateway, and it includes some of the most remarkable relief sculpture. It is an Ionic temple that is very, very small. Notice it doesn't have colonnade going all the way around the sides. The cella walls have been extended all the way to the outside, but it contains this remarkable sculpture of a figure of Athena in the of Nike. Nike means victory, and you can see she has wings, almost like what we would think of in Christian art as an angel. But you notice that peek-a-boo effect, the quote-unquote wet drapery that clings to the body, where the mask can protrude like the thigh, but then covers up where it's inappropriate to be looking. You see the figure is either taking off or tying her sandal. Kind of a remarkable figure into its natural movement and its believability in its response to weight. Why this matters so much to us, take a look at American buildings that are literally reproductions of this kind of style and even proportion of the architecture of ancient Greece. These are some of the earliest examples of federal buildings in the United States. This is William Strickland's design for the Bank of Pennsylvania, which is essentially a reproduction, at least of the portico of and proportions of the Parthenon. We see Strickland doing this again and again in calling examples from classical Greek sculpture, in this case, a sculptural architectural monument to a dead singer becomes the monument, or becomes the model, rather, for his design for the cupola for the Tennessee State Capitol and for the design on the Merchants Exchange. We'll see American sculptor Horatio Greenough working in a way that imitates Greek sculpture in a style we call neoclassical. Can you believe that there would ever have been a statue of George Washington shirtless, dressed kind of like a Greek god? Well, that did happen, and that's all because we're trying to make our buildings, our culture, appeal to this idea that they belong to a long tradition, a tradition that does include, in the case of ancient Greece, the beginnings of democracy. Now, granted, that was only for not for women and not for slaves, only for landholding men, but still it was a voting body that controlled government, and it was the first example of such. So we imitate that style in a way in our architecture to imitate that culture. What else do we want to say? The Greek sculpture or architecture includes, of course, the introduction of theater, and the Romans will take what does have here for the Greek theater and put two together to create the amphitheater, the most famous of which we'll see, of course, is the Colosseum in Rome. We definitely want to talk about sculptural proportion, and especially we want to remember the work of the sculptor Polykleitos. Polykleitos created a sculpture known to us as the Doryphorus. He called it the canon because it had all of the proportional rules that he thought were the ideal. Most Greek artists of his time period followed him. It does become a little more elegant, it does become a little taller, but the proportional system that Polykleitos worked out for the classical era is a system in which the figure's proportions are based on the size of the head. So head times 7 equals the overall height of the figure. And you can see that artists maintained that proportional system for many decades after the creation of this original figure. So Polykleitos Doryphorus, what you're seeing is in fact a Roman copy in marble of the original statue that Polyclitus made in bronze, which has been lost. So even though we're looking at the Roman copy of it, this is considered to be the work of Polyclitus. He's the original artist, even though we're looking at a copy. It is not unusual for most of Polyclitus's work because he did use these more dramatic poses, so a marble version is going to be missing some of its limbs. But you definitely can get a sense of this almost being the same person again and again and again because of the proportional reality that Polyclitus brought to the works. Myron, an artist following in the footsteps of Polyclitus, did a piece you probably recognize, the Discus Thrower, Discobolus. This, of course, again, a Roman copy of the original bronze statue, and you can see the damage that this one has had repaired. If you look, though, at the proportions of this figure in comparison to Polyclitus's Doryphorus, they are essentially identical. So again, the emphasis here is on perfection. It's not meant necessarily to be a specific idiosyncratic portrait of an individual with its own unique facial feature. The idea of any monument or statue in ancient Greece at this point is really about trying to emphasize the overall perfection, which of course is going to be perceived by them to be male. It's going to always be youthful, athletic, and stoic, sort of emotionless. We do start to see more female figures nude, and especially if they are depictions of goddesses, as is this case, the Aphrodite Ethnitos. Again, she is a Roman copy, but you see she has all of the qualities that we have come to expect of Greek art. She is in a contrapposto pose with a very pronounced S curve. The first, I think, example that we can really look at of a female goddess being presented fully in the nude, and this is by the artist Praxiteles. Praxiteles, again, Roman copy, but he definitely gives us even more exaggerated S curves. The weight shift in this one, the hip being so much on an angle in this case, requires there to be that column for Hermes to be able to lean on, holding the infant wine god Dionysus. So we definitely have multiple cases of this example of making the figures lean even more fully into this weight shift that we've seen in any of the preceding examples or time periods. We want to know Lysippus's Apoxiomenos. The Apoxiomenos is, again, a classic example of the weight shift, but it does represent an elongation of the form. Now we're in the 300s. If you do a proportional ratio on this figure, he's a little bit taller than average human head height. He's about 6 feet 9 inches tall. If you were to measure his head versus his overall height, you would come up with a ratio of 8 heads tall. So Polyclitus's canon began with a 7-head tall ratio, a little bit more squat, and we now have a more elegant, longer ratio here in the work of Lysippus. Apoxiomenos means oil scraper. What he's doing is actually a form of bathing after exercise. He actually has covered his body in oil, and he's using a tool to scrape the oil off, and the oil is removing the sweat and the dirt. Lysippus figure of Hercules. You can see he's, I suppose we would say, swole. His musculature is much wider than we would be expected to see. A remarkable example there. Lysippus was the personal sculptor to Alexander the Great, and so you see an example here of sculpture that starts to look like actual specific individuals. This is definitely an example of trying to put a little more naturalism into portraiture, and you can see that in Lysippus' statue of Socrates, which is definitely not an idealized form. So we are beginning to see a shift or a change.